Some games build hype with trailers, promises, and excitement, only to crash hard at launch. You know that title that looked unmissable but turned out to be a disaster? Today we're taking a look at a few games that flopped hard, even with big budgets, major studios, and solid ideas behind them. Some of them shut down studios, others just broke hearts. And I'll be honest, a few of these really let me down. And let's see how many of these fooled you too. If you're new here, welcome to Play Hunters. And if you can hit that subscribe button to help the channel grow, I'd really appreciate it, from one gamer to another. There's no way to start this video without talking about Concord, one of the biggest disasters in recent gaming history. The game was in development for nearly a decade, and when it finally dropped in August 2024, it barely lasted 2 weeks before being pulled from stores. The studio behind it was shut down too. The craziest part, it was a paid game. In a genre where everything is free to play now, that alone pushed people away. It clearly tried to follow in Overwatch's footsteps, but showed up way too late. Players had already moved on from that formula. On top of that, Concord tried to market itself as something massive, but delivered nothing exciting. Sure, it looked good and had flashy visuals, but underneath it was just more of the same. And in an oversaturated market, that's basically a death sentence. The player base vanished almost instantly. Sales were dismal. Reviews were brutal. The studio scrambled to contain the damage. What's wild is that all of this could have been avoided. The community makes it very clear what it wants, yet some studios just keep ignoring it. Nobody was asking for Overwatch 2.0, especially not years later, and without any soul behind it. This was the perfect example of what happens when you pour time and money into a game nobody asked for. They didn't listen, didn't read the room, and ended up releasing something that already felt outdated on day one. No one sabotaged Concord. It wasn't unfairly judged. It just followed the wrong path for way too long and paid the price. Then there's The Day Before. I truly believed in that project. I've always wanted an open-world zombie survival game with co-op tension and freedom to explore with friends. The pitch was perfect. The trailers looked insane, promising strategic gameplay, immersive tension, and full-on exploration. It was the kind of game that sells itself on concept alone. But even early on, people were skeptical. It looked too good to be true. I had my doubts too, but I wanted to believe. And when the game finally launched, it felt like something entirely different. It was a mess. Bugs everywhere, awful performance, and a gameplay structure that just didn't work. Movement felt stiff, combat was awkward, and enemy AI was basically non-existent. It was like everything we saw in those trailers had been smoke and mirrors. There was no tension, no survival skill, just frustration and awkwardness. Servers were unstable, loot was all over the place, and the world felt lifeless. The community immediately realized something was wrong, and instead of fixing things, the devs just gave up. The result? One of the most embarrassing launches I've ever seen. It's hard to think of a game that let people down as much as Marvel's Avengers. Huge IP, massive budget, all the right ingredients, and still it crashed and burned. Instead of giving players what they wanted, the game doubled down on repetitive grind, loot mechanics, and generic missions. A lot of people dropped it fast, feeling like they were playing something soulless and lifeless. From the start, the whole live service Avengers thing felt off. Everyone wanted an epic single-player story, but what we got was a short, weak campaign that felt more like a tutorial for the boring multiplayer. The combat had its moments, but got old fast. And the hero? They looked and felt like knockoffs of the MCU versions. No charm, no spark. Even after updates and new characters, the main issue never changed. The game just wasn't fun. Timed events came and went with little substance. Microtransactions annoyed people from day one, and the lack of real content updates killed any hope of recovery. The player base disappeared, and even the devs seemed to lose faith. Marvel's Avengers flopped commercially, selling about 40% less than expected. Support was dropped not long after. In September 2023, it was delisted from digital stores. Bugs, weak story, cash grab mechanics, and the slow rollout of new content buried what could have been a legendary game, but turned out to be one of the most disappointing of the generation. Tomb Raider Underworld came out during a weird time for the franchise. The series was still trying to find its footing, and this entry was supposed to continue the momentum from Legend. It looked better, had a more ambitious scope, but it stumbled. Clunky controls and a frustrating camera dragged everything down. Combat lacked punch. Enemy AI was a joke. Still, there were some good ideas in the level design, bigger tombs and more complex puzzles. But all of that was undercut by how rough the game felt to actually play. Controls were imprecise, and that alone killed the flow. It felt like the game needed more time in the oven. The story tried to mix Norse mythology with personal drama, but came off confusing and shallow. The darker tones sort of worked, but didn't carry the game. And the timing couldn't have been worse. It launched alongside Gears of War 2 and Left 4 Dead. Competing with giants like that was a losing battle. Sales were underwhelming, and Underworld ended up marking the end of a tired era for the franchise. It wasn't a total failure, but it clearly needed a reboot. And that's exactly what came next, a full-on reset that left the past behind and aimed for something modern and bold. Sometimes a fall is exactly what sets the stage for a major comeback. The Lord of the Rings, Gollum was one of those games I genuinely wanted to enjoy. As a fan of Tolkien's universe, the idea of following a side story always intrigued me. But that excitement quickly turned to frustration. The game felt unfinished from the start. Outdated structure, technical issues everywhere, and gameplay that honestly gets on your nerves. It had none of the magic or care the franchise deserves. It's hard to accept that a project with such a powerful brand was released in that condition. The graphics felt straight out of the PlayStation 2 era, and not the good ones either, more like those mid-tier titles you rented on a whim. Poor character models, bland environments, and glaring bugs all over. Clunky movement and repetitive missions made it feel like you were playing a rough pre-alpha on a shoestring budget. And what makes it worse is that the story didn't help either. Gollum could have been a tense, dark, psychological tale, but the script felt lost, like it didn't even know what it wanted to be. Nothing pulled you in. The interactions were shallow, the objectives meaningless, and it all felt like a desperate attempt to be different, but without any real success. It was like the game was made by people who didn't understand the universe or its fans. In the end, it became a punchline. Reviews were brutal, ratings hit rock bottom, and it's still remembered as one of the worst launches of the generation. The studio even canceled another game in the same universe that was already in development. A true disaster, not even worth pretending to forgive. Mass Effect Andromeda carried the weight of one of the most respected RPG franchises ever. The promise was huge, a new galaxy, a fresh crew, revamped mechanics, but the game stumbled hard. Blank facial expressions, laughable bugs, and bizarre animations dominated its early days. It didn't take long for it to become a meme. Compilations of its worst moments flooded the internet. It honestly felt rushed. Dialogue was generic. The narrative took forever to pick up, and many missions felt like copy-paste fetch quests. Even with improved graphics and more fluid combat, it still gave off an unfinished vibe. And coming from the same studio that made the original trilogy, the letdown was even greater. That said, it wasn't all bad. The galaxy they built had some fascinating planets, and the shooting mechanics were more agile than ever. Over time, patches fixed a lot of the issues, but the damage was already done. The franchise's reputation took a hit, and players' trust was shaken. Eventually, all planned DLC was scrapped, and the series was put on indefinite pause. Some fans still argue that the game was judged too harshly, but there's no denying it launched at the wrong time with way too many rough edges. It's a textbook case of out-of-control hype and poorly managed expectations. Vampyr aimed to offer something different, a dark narrative set in a plague-ridden London. It had a strong concept where every life you take matters. It wasn't just about action, but moral choices. The setup was promising, but the game never quite caught on. Sales fell short, and it didn't hit the mark commercially. One of the biggest problems was the combat. It felt clunky, repetitive, and stiff. That really hurt the pacing, especially in a game built around choices and semi-open exploration. The technical side didn't help either. Constant bugs, long load times, and inconsistent AI made the whole thing feel like a struggle to play. That said, Vampyr had some great qualities. The atmosphere was rich, the dialogue was well written, and the moral choice system created real tension, feeding your strength or preserving your humanity. Every death carried weight. The plot developed in an intriguing way, and the way the world responded to your actions was a clear high point. It had so much potential, but stumbled on the basics. Still, it built a loyal fan base. Many people still hope for a sequel that fixes the flaws while keeping the dark tone and impactful decisions. It wasn't a total failure, just a game that promised more than it delivered when it mattered most, and in a competitive market that usually comes at a high cost. Beyond Two Souls was one of those games I picked up right at launch. From the start, I really liked the concept. It was all about choices, with your decisions shaping the story, and that's always been my kind of game. The narrative was emotional, deep, and full of moments that hit hard. I remember finishing it and feeling like I'd played something truly special. While it got plenty of praise, the game didn't perform that well commercially. One common complaint was the pacing. It swung between slow, quiet scenes and bursts of action. The non-linear storytelling also confused some players. Even with big-name actors involved, it wasn't enough to boost sales the way the studio hoped. It ended up selling around 2.8 million copies, less than expected, especially after Heavy Rain's success, and it definitely split opinions. Some people wanted more freedom and felt let down by all the QTEs and heavily guided moments. Those expecting more traditional gameplay were disappointed. Still, it's a game I remember fondly. Not perfect, but it left its mark and offered something unique at the time. When I think of games that didn't get the love they deserved but tried something bold, Beyond Two Souls always comes to mind. It proved that interactive storytelling could be powerful, even if the mainstream didn't fully embrace it. And here's a fun fact. The actress who played the main character actually had her face used without permission as inspiration for Ellie in The Last of Us, which led to a lawsuit and forced Sony to change Ellie's face design later on. Mirror's Edge Catalyst had the tough job of reimagining a cult classic that already had a loyal fan base. With its clean visuals, fluid movement, and agile lead, it promised freedom and fast-paced urban action, but somewhere along the way, something got lost. The attempt to deepen the story ended up slowing everything down. The open world felt empty, lifeless, and the narrative never really took off. It looked nice, but had no soul. Movement remained its strongest point. Wall running and navigating the environment to avoid danger was still fun, but the game quickly demanded constant repetition of the same activities. Side missions dragged on, and every objective felt the same. It was like the game ran fast, but had no direction. Another issue was the underwhelming gameplay. Hand-to-hand combat lacked excitement and often broke the flow of the parkour. Avoiding guns was a bold idea, but poorly executed. Enemies weren't challenging, and encounters felt forced. The city, despite its beauty, felt like a lifeless stage, a theme park with no fun. Still, some people look back on it with fondness. A game focused on movement and flow still has its appeal, but this one got stuck between wanting to innovate and failing to truly impress. It was a bold swing that stumbled in execution. With sales falling short, it ended up as just another forgotten reboot in gaming history. The wonderful 101 Remastered came with the mission of reviving a game that had flown under the radar on the Wii U, but instead of winning over a new audience, it only reminded people why it didn't work the first time. The chaotic premise of controlling dozens of heroes at once felt more confusing than engaging. Even with upgraded visuals, the game felt trapped in the past. The design screamed Wii U in a world that had moved on. The combat system asked you to draw shapes with the analog stick. Cool in theory, messy in execution. The camera got in the way, inputs were inconsistent, and the tutorials didn't help. You needed patience to understand the game, but most gave up before getting there. The pacing was off, and the controls made everything harder than it needed to be. It felt more like a lazy re-release than a true remake. Even with Platinum Games behind it, a studio known for top-tier action titles, this one never reached their usual standard. The over-the-top style, cartoonish heroes, and chaotic battles got old fast. It was like watching a loud cartoon scream at you non-stop. The fun didn't last, and the frustration took over. Without nostalgia for the original, most players found little to enjoy. Commercially, it flopped. Sales were low, and interest vanished quickly. The game proved that not every cult classic deserves a second chance without serious updates. What once worked on a niche console couldn't survive the test of time. In the end, this remaster became just another forgettable release, soulless, ignored, and with no payoff. Biomutant promised something big, an open-world RPG with dynamic combat and a quirky visual identity. You'd play as a mutant animal in a post-apocalyptic world full of factions, moral choices, and customization. But everything that looked amazing in the trailers arrived in players' hands feeling raw and unfinished. It was too ambitious for the structure it had, and the hype turned into disappointment. The first red flag was the combat. Despite the variety of weapons and powers, it all felt shallow and weightless. Enemies weren't challenging, and fights became button-mashing chores. The movement was clunky, and the aiming system didn't help. The game wanted to do everything but didn't really get anything right. Even the boss fights felt dull. Narrative-wise, things didn't fare much better. A narrator voiced over every conversation, which got old fast. Moral choices felt empty, and progress was slow. Creating your own mutant was a cool idea, but it barely changed the world. The map was huge, but lifeless. A big, colorful void with little to say. Even so, Biomutant found a small audience who appreciated its uniqueness. But overall, it's remembered as a game that reached too far. Sales were underwhelming, and critics pointed to a lack of polish in nearly every aspect. The potential was there, but it got buried under poor decisions. A clear case of good ideas without solid execution. Man, I'll be honest with you. When they announced Babylon's Fall, I tried to stay open-minded. I mean, it had platinum involved, right? Expectations were sky high for crazy action, something like Nier or Bayonetta. But when it launched, it felt like a beta for a game that was already outdated. The art style was weird, the visuals screamed 208, and everything just felt empty. Combat, the part that should have shined, was a repetitive mess of meaningless combos. Levels felt recycled. Enemies were all clones, and you'd catch yourself thinking, why am I playing this? Where's the thrill? The whole thing felt like it was on autopilot from the jump. Even with promises of updates, events, and new content, nothing worked. The game died before it even got going. The player base vanished, and soon enough, everything was shut down. Servers gone, project canceled. And honestly, no one was surprised. It was a game with no identity, chasing a trend that was long gone. It became a textbook case of how a big-name studio doesn't guarantee success. And here's the harsh truth. If no one asked for this kind of game, forcing it won't work. The audience had already moved on, and Babylon's Fall got left behind. Forspoken was one of those games that looked like it would change everything. A massive magical world, a modern lead thrown into a fantasy setting, and a flashy movement system. I remember getting hyped, but when it dropped, that spark vanished. Everything they promised was there, technically, but with no soul, no impact. The dialogue constantly broke the mood. It was full of awkward jokes and banter that just annoyed more than entertained, and even though the world looked gorgeous, it was empty. Few interactions, generic tasks. It felt like they polished the trailer but forgot to fill in the game. A game trying so hard to be modern that it forgot to be fun. Even the combat, with all its flashy effects, got old quickly. You'd learn the spells and realize the variety wasn't that deep. Progression was shallow, enemies felt repetitive, and the whole thing kept asking for patience. Not because it was challenging, but because you were always waiting for it to finally get good, and it never did. Forspoken undersold, and ended up as more of a burden than a win for Square. And that's sad because you could see the effort behind it. But effort without direction, and without listening to what players actually want, just becomes another pretty game nobody remembers. Immortals of Aveum looked like it had potential. First-person magic shooter, no guns, just raw spellcasting. That sounded bold, and early on it was fun. You felt the power, cast flashy spells, the action was fast. But after a while, it all started blending together. That excitement quickly turned into routine. Sure, the spells had different colors and effects, but in the end, it was always the same loop-hold button, dodge, explode stuff. Enemies became damage sponges, bosses just dragged on. You didn't feel like you were evolving, just surviving the next arena. The story tried to be epic, but drowned in boring text dumps. Even though the game looked nice, it didn't invite exploration. Environments felt like well-made models, but with no life. Outside of combat, you'd hit puzzles that slowed everything down. There was something there, but it never really clicked. It was all style, no spark. In the end, Immortals of Aveum was another big promise left unfulfilled. A cool idea with no rhythm, something that tried to be different, but forgot to be fun. And when that happens, no spell can save it. Redfall looked like it was going to be a fun co-op game with vampires, crazy weapons, and a city overrun by chaos. But it delivered everything halfway. I remember the first trailer having a cool vibe, but when the game actually came out, it felt empty. Generic missions, dumb enemies, and an open world that looked more like a desert with buildings. On the technical side, it was a disaster. Horrific bugs, frozen AI, FPS drops. It felt unfinished. And it wasn't just an impression, this was clearly a project that needed more development time. But they released it anyway. Maybe they were banking on the studio's name or hoping the subscription model would cover it up. It didn't. The biggest issue was the lack of soul. Playing it felt like no one involved actually cared about the story. The characters were shallow, the dialogue felt forced, Even the soundtrack sounded out of place. It all worked like a rough draft of a decent idea that got abandoned and thrown into a box for sale. Redfall joined the list of the most problematic releases of the generation. Not because it tried something new and failed, but because it didn't try anything at all. Just another rushed product, pretending to be modern without getting the basics right. Wanted Dead is the kind of game that tries so hard to be different that it forgets the essentials. It wanted to be part arcade, part hack and slash, part shooter, and ended up being none of them. From the moment you start playing, you're left confused about what the game is even going for. The art direction felt stuck in the past, the dialogue was bizarre, and the pacing was weird. Even the attempt at retro charm was poorly executed. The difficulty felt unbalanced, not challenging. Bosses hit like trucks, while your controls locked up during key moments. The camera was a mess, movement felt stiff, and the music could have come from a random mobile game. The worst part? You could feel there was something interesting underneath, but the game didn't want you to enjoy it. Stage structure killed the mood, cutscenes popped in at odd times, and the story was told in a disjointed mess. It felt like 3 games duct-taped together. Wanted Dead landed with a thud. No nostalgia, no innovation, just a noisy, confusing mess trying to get noticed, but with nothing worth noticing. Need for Speed Unbound tried to breathe new life into the franchise with a bold mix of street art and realistic graphics layered with cartoon-style effects. And honestly, at first, I liked the idea. It was different. But just a few minutes in, it became clear that it was all style, no substance. Underneath the flashy look, it was the same old game, just less engaging. The progression system dragged, the AI felt too artificial, and the races gave off serious déjà vu. The events didn't excite, and even the sense of speed, the heart of the series, felt sluggish. Not to mention the bugs, which were frequent and broke immersion constantly. Even the customization, usually a highlight of the franchise, felt limited. You always felt boxed in, unable to really play around with your cars like before. The map was forgettable, the story barely existed, and the characters, let's not even go there. You weren't playing for the fun, just for the memory of what the series used to be. Despite trying to reboot the series, Unbound came and went with barely a whisper. Low sales, low buzz, a flashy rebrand that failed to find its soul. Watch Dogs Legion came in with a bold idea, let you play as anyone in the world. On paper, it sounded amazing. But in practice, it became one of the biggest misfires I've seen. Sure, you had freedom, but without a strong lead character, everything felt bland, like you were playing as NPCs the entire time. The version of London in the game looked nice in detail, but it lacked real life. Missions got repetitive fast, and the recruit anyone mechanic quickly turned into a chore. There was no real progress. Dialogue felt robotic, side stories were uninteresting, and even the music felt empty. The whole thing was too mechanical. Combat was clunky, AI failed at the worst times, and the hacking, which should have been the highlight, became repetitive fast. The game lacked urgency, and even though it tried to look rebellious and futuristic, it felt staged. There was no soul, no identity, no real reason to keep playing. Legion had a big budget and heavy marketing, but stumbled hard. It tried to be different without adding any depth. A perfect example of a shiny idea ruined by shallow execution. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy wasn't bad, it was just overlooked. After the mess that was Marvel's Avengers, most people didn't give it a chance. Everyone assumed it would be another cash grab full of microtransactions. But this was something else. Even with its limitations, the game told a really solid story, had great dialogue, and the characters were genuinely fun. The combat wasn't groundbreaking, but it worked, with good rhythm, clever ideas, and clear care in every detail. And all of it offline, with no forced monetization. Unfortunately, the damage was already done. Square Enix said it didn't meet sales expectations and quickly moved on. It sold poorly, didn't generate much buzz, and became a hidden gem. For those who played it through, it was a pleasant surprise, but most people missed it entirely. Guardians of the Galaxy deserved better. It wasn't perfect, but it was way better than people expected. Bad timing, past failures, and weak marketing buried a game that could have been a real hit. Mighty No. 9 is a textbook case of hype killed by poor execution. It was supposed to be the spiritual successor to Mega Man, made by Keiji Inafune himself. The community rallied behind it on Kickstarter, raising a ton of money. Everyone believed it would be something special. What we got instead was painful. Even early trailers showed signs of trouble. The visuals looked rushed and dated. When the game launched, the gameplay felt stiff, the controls unresponsive, and the boss fights were just frustrating. The soundtrack was forgettable, and the art direction looked like a placeholder demo. Levels had no flow, difficulty was all over the place, and the scoring system that was supposed to add depth felt like a gimmick. It all came off as unfinished. Even hardcore fans had a hard time pushing through. The overall feeling was disappointment and wasted potential. Mighty No. 9 went down as one of the biggest failures in crowdfunding history. A big name, massive backing, and a promise that was never fulfilled. Proof that having a legendary creator isn't always enough. Gotham Knights came in with massive pressure, not just because of the Gotham name, but because it followed one of the greatest superhero game series ever, the Arkham franchise. And honestly, it felt like a slap in the face to everything that came before it. Everything felt worse, like they ignored what had already worked so well. Seeing something so anticipated fall apart like this is just sad. Combat, once fluid, tight, and thrilling, became sluggish and awkward. Enemies were repetitive, hits felt weightless, and the camera got in the way more than it helped. Movement was clunky, traversing the city got boring fast, and overall, the game felt like it needed months more work. Nothing flowed like it should. Visually, it didn't impress either. The city looked generic, the characters lacked any charm, and the effects felt last gen. Even the story, which should have been a strong point, fell flat. No pacing, no twists, nothing to hold you. And the worst part, this was supposed to be the spiritual successor to a legendary series. It's like Gotham Knights deliberately ignored everything fans wanted. The result was a game that didn't excite, didn't surprise, and left no lasting impression. For anyone who played the earlier games, the disappointment hits fast. It fails in gameplay, story, graphics, and atmosphere. A painful step backward. Crackdown 3 looked promising on paper, but crumbled as it approached release. The idea was simple over-the-top action, large-scale destruction, and chaotic open-world fun. But what players got was a shallow, repetitive game that felt stuck in the past. Not even the flashy marketing could hide how generic it really was. Combat had some fun moments early on, but quickly became a bland cycle of soulless tasks. The weapons didn't excite, enemies were carbon copies, and challenges never evolved. Lack of variety really hurt, especially when the game kept making you repeat the same loop over and over. The city, which should have been vibrant, felt like an empty set. Another major letdown was the pile of promises made during its long development. They hyped cloud-powered destruction, advanced AI, and intense battles. None of that delivered. It felt like the game was launched just to meet a deadline, and the long development cycle only made the final product more disappointing. Crackdown 3 felt like a last-gen game with no ambition. It didn't innovate, didn't entertain, and was forgotten just days after release. It had potential, but it was executed like a checklist project, automatic, uninspired, and lifeless. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was supposed to be the natural evolution of its predecessor, but it made so many questionable choices that it became a textbook case of how to ruin a working formula. Ubisoft tried to force a live service structure into it, stuffing in systems that clashed with the original vision. Tactical gameplay took a backseat to loot, grinding, and generic mechanics. Fans of the more grounded style felt completely alienated. The story is messy, the dialogue falls flat, and the pacing is painfully slow. Instead of drawing you in, the game throws you into repetitive tasks, bloated systems, and menus that feel like a chore. Even the progression feels locked behind hours of grinding for tiny upgrades. And the bugs at launch just made everything worse. There are some good-looking moments, but nothing that truly makes up for the mess. Enemy AI is weak, stealth barely works, and combat rarely demands any real strategy. It feels like the game wanted to be everything at once and ended up being good at nothing. It tried to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. Even after updates, Ghost Recon Breakpoint never regained the trust of its community. Reception was so cold that it pushed the studio to rethink the franchise's direction entirely. A sequel meant to raise the bar, but instead, it buried the goodwill built over past titles. So tell me, did you buy any of these games? Which ones disappointed you the most? Or maybe there's one here you'll defend to the end. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if you haven't seen it yet, check the card above. I'm linking a video with the best games that have already launched in 2025 and are 100% worth your money. If you enjoyed the video, hit that subscribe button to help the channel grow. Big hug, good gameplay, and see you tomorrow.